For the Walkers, this vacation was supposed to be an escape from the challenges they face daily. But being a black family in an exclusive resort meant prejudice followed them even here. What started as a peaceful day by the pool ended in public humiliation, fear, and an arrest that exposed the ugliness of racism. But they weren't just any family. They were fighters. Stay with us as we share their journey from injustice to empowerment and their battle to make their voices heard in a world stacked against them. The sun shone brightly over the sprawling luxury resort, its reflection dancing on the clear blue water of the pool. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sound of waves crashing in the distance completed the idyllic setting. For the Walkers, this was supposed to be a break from their busy lives, a much-needed escape to reconnect as a family. James Walker, a tall and confident man with years of experience as an FBI agent, stepped out of their rental car. He stretched briefly, his muscular frame moving fluidly in his casual vacation attire. Beside him, his wife Mia adjusted her sunglasses, her elegant features softened by a rare smile of relaxation. For months they had been planning this getaway, setting aside their demanding careers to focus on their family. Caleb and Lily tumbled out of the car next, bubbling with excitement. Caleb, at 12, was already showing signs of his father's build, his lanky frame stretching out with every growth spurt. He adjusted his baseball hat and scanned the resort with curious eyes. 7-year-old Lily, with her curly pigtails bouncing, held tightly to her mother's hand, her radiant smile lighting up her small face. "Look at that pool," Caleb exclaimed, pointing at the expansive area surrounded by rows of lounge chairs. "Can we go swimming now, Mommy?" Lily asked, her voice high-pitched with anticipation. "Soon, sweetheart," Mia replied with a chuckle. Let's check in first." As the family walked toward the resort entrance, the warmth of their moment was quietly interrupted. Mia felt it first. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. The valet's overly formal tone as he took the keys from James. The way the concierge's smile faltered for a split second before recovering. She caught the fleeting stares of other guests, their eyes lingering a moment too long on the family as they passed. James noticed it too. He always did. Years of experience had taught him to read the room, and here, the room said, "You don't belong." Still, he ignored it, pushing down the familiar frustration that bubbled beneath the surface. This was a vacation, after all. Inside the grand lobby, Mia marveled at the polished marble floors and high ceilings, adorned with chandeliers that sparkled like stars. It was everything they had hoped for when booking the trip: luxury, relaxation, and quality time. "Reservation under Walker," James said to the receptionist, his voice steady but warm. The receptionist hesitated briefly, her eyes flicking over the family before she forced a smile. "Of course, sir." Mia's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched the woman tap away on her computer. She wasn't being rude exactly, but there was something about her demeanor, something she'd seen before. It was in moments like these that Mia and James often reflected on their shared reality. Both had worked tirelessly to achieve success in their fields. James, an FBI agent who had climbed the ranks through grit and determination, and Mia, a lawyer known for her fierce advocacy for underserved communities. Yet no amount of professionalism, education, or financial success could shield them from the judgment that came with the color of their skin. "I'll bet the Hendersons didn't get this much scrutiny," Mia muttered under her breath. James glanced at her and gave a small knowing smile. "Probably not," he replied softly. "But let's not let it ruin today." Meanwhile, Caleb and Lily remained blissfully unaware. Caleb was already dreaming about the pool, imagining himself racing his sister and winning every time. Lily, clutching her favorite stuffed animal, twirled in place, humming a song to herself. To them, this was a magical adventure, free of the complexities their parents had to navigate. After what felt like too long, the receptionist handed over their room keys. "Enjoy your stay," she said, the words cheerful but hollow. The family made their way to their suite, the children dashing inside as soon as the door opened. The room was spacious and bright, with a balcony overlooking the ocean. Caleb claimed the bed closest to the window, while Lily insisted on trying out the couch, declaring it the best seat in the house. James stood on the balcony, taking in the view. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, the horizon meeting the sky in a blur of blue. For a moment, he let himself breathe, let the weight on his shoulders lift just a little. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mia joined him, leaning against the railing. "It is," James said, his voice quieter now. He paused, then added, "I just wish—" Mia touched his arm gently. "I know." Yeah, they didn't need to say it aloud. This was their reality. Moments of peace always tinged with the awareness of being seen as different. Even here, in a place where everyone was supposed to feel welcome. "Mama, Daddy, come on," Lily's voice called from inside, snapping them out of their thoughts. James and Mia exchanged a glance and a smile, silently agreeing to let the moment go. This was their time with their children, and nothing was going to take that away. "Coming," Mia called back, her voice brightening. As the family headed down to the pool, James carried a quiet resolve in his heart. He would protect these moments of joy for his family, no matter what. The sun was still shining, the water still sparkling. For now, the sun blazed overhead as the walkers settled into their spot by the resort's pristine pool. James leaned back in a lounge chair, his sunglasses shielding his eyes from the glare. Mia, sitting beside him, was flipping through a novel she hadn't touched in weeks. Caleb was in the shallow end of the pool, challenging Lily to a race she was delighted to lose every time. Their laughter echoed across the serene resort, blending with the gentle ripple of the water. But James, ever alert, felt something was off. It was subtle at first. The way a server's gaze lingered on them a second too long, or how a couple nearby whispered to each other, their glances darting toward his family. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the rare peace of the moment. It wasn't until he noticed the security guard approaching from the other side of the pool that his instincts kicked in. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark polo shirt tucked neatly into slacks. His stride was deliberate, and his eyes were fixed directly on James. Here we go, James muttered under his breath, sitting up straighter in his chair. Mia lowered her book, following his gaze. She immediately caught on. "What's this about?" she asked softly, her tone wary. James shook his head. "Let's find out." The guard stopped a few feet away, his posture stiff but not overtly hostile. "Excuse me, sir," he began, his tone polite but with an edge that James recognized all too well. "Are you a guest here?" James tilted his head slightly, removing his sunglasses. "Yes, we are," he replied evenly. "Can I get your room number?" the guard asked, his eyes scanning James as if searching for something. Mia straightened in her chair, her sharp instincts firing. She had seen this before. It wasn't about security, it was about suspicion. The kind of suspicion her family had encountered in upscale restaurants, shopping malls, and now apparently vacation resorts. James, keeping his composure, replied, "Room 305. We checked in yesterday." The guard nodded but didn't move. His presence lingered, his posture rigid. "I'll just need to confirm that with the front desk." "A standard procedure." Mia set her book aside, her expression hardening. "Standard procedure for what?" she asked, her voice calm but pointed. "We're sitting here, minding our own business, and you're questioning us. Why?" The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "It's nothing personal, ma'am. We've had some issues with non-guests using the facilities." James gave Mia a subtle glance, silently asking her to let it go. "Let him check," he said quietly. The guard nodded again and turned, walking toward the front desk, but his departure did little to ease the tension that had now settled over the walkers. Mia muttered, shaking her head. "I didn't see him ask anyone else for their room number." "You're right, but let's not make a scene. The kids are here." Meanwhile, Caleb had noticed the interaction and was making his way back to the lounge chairs, water dripping from his hair. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "Nothing, buddy," James replied, forcing a small smile. "Just a misunderstanding." But Caleb wasn't convinced. His young eyes dotted toward the god, then back to his parents. Why was he asking about our room? "Because some people don't like to believe we belong here," Mia said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Mia," James said gently, glancing at Lily, who was still splashing in the shallow end, oblivious to the conversation. "It's the truth," Mia replied, keeping her voice low. "They need to know the truth." Before James could respond, the guard returned, this time accompanied by another man. The second guard, younger and slimmer, had a cocky demeanor that set James on edge immediately. His name tag read Taylor. "Is there a problem?" Mia asked, before either of them could speak, her tone sharper now. The first guard, Grant, shook his head. "No problem, ma'am. We're just confirming the information." Taylor, however, wasn't as restrained. We've had a lot of people sneaking into the pool area lately," he said, his eyes fixed on James. "It's just our job to make sure everyone here is supposed to be here." James raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. "I already gave you my room number. You can confirm it. There's no need for all this." Taylor crossed his arms, his stance challenging. "It's standard procedure," he said. though his tone made it clear he was enjoying the power dynamic. Mia stood up, her sundress swaying slightly in the breeze. "Are you asking everyone else here for their room number or just us?" Taylor's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Ma'am, this isn't personal. We're just doing our job." "It sure feels personal," Mia shot back. "We're here as paying guests, just like everyone else. So why are you treating us like we don't belong?" James stepped forward, placing a hand on Mia's arm. "Mia, let me handle this," he said softly. She exhaled sharply but stepped back, her jaw tight with frustration. Caleb watched the exchange, his confusion deepening. "Dad, are we in trouble?" "No, son," James said, glancing down at him. "We're not in trouble. Some people just don't know how to treat others with respect." Taylor's smirk returned, but Grant looked increasingly uncomfortable. He glanced around, noticing that some of the other guests had started watching the interaction. A few even had their phones out, recording quietly from their lounge chairs. "Look," Grant said, his tone softer now, "we'll confirm with the front desk and be out of your way." "Make it quick," Mia said, crossing her arms. Grant nodded and walked away, but Taylor lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning James and then Mia, before finally following his colleague. As soon as they were out of earshot, Mia turned to James. "This is ridiculous. We shouldn't have to deal with this." "I know," James said quietly, "but it's nothing new." "It shouldn't have to be," she replied, her voice cracking slightly. "The kids shouldn't have to see this." James glanced at Caleb, who was still standing close to him, his face a mixture of confusion and unease. Lily, thankfully, was still in her own world, splashing happily in the pool. "It's okay, Mia," James said, his voice firm. "We'll get through this. We always do." But as he sat back down, his eyes flicked to the other guests, the ones who were still watching, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. He could feel the weight of their stares, and he knew this wasn't over yet. The Walkers had come here for peace, but instead they had been reminded once again that peace was something they would always have to fight for. The tension hung thick in the air as Officer Grant returned to the pool area. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 police officers followed closely behind, their crisp white uniforms stark against the vibrant backdrop of the resort. James immediately sat up, his trained eyes assessing the situation, while Mia's grip on her book tightened. The officers, Miller, a stout man in his late 30s with a hard-set jaw, and Bradley, older and slightly more measured in his demeanor, approached the Walkers. The buzz of the poolside quieted as other guests turned their attention to the scene unfolding before them. "Sir, we've had a report about unauthorized individuals using the pool," Miller began, his tone already accusatory. James raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "We're guests here. Room 305. That's already been confirmed with the front desk." Miller's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking over James as though sizing him up. I'm going to need to see some ID." James exhaled, pulling out his wallet and presenting his driver's license. "Here's my ID. And just so you're aware, I'm a federal agent with the FBI." He reached into his wallet again and held up his badge, the gold glinting in the sunlight. Miller barely glanced at it before scoffing. "I'll need real ID, not a souvenir badge you picked up somewhere." Mia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone patio. Excuse me?" she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "That's a federal badge? Are you seriously questioning a federal agent's credentials?" "I'm doing my job, ma'am," Miller said dismissively, turning his attention back to James. "Now, are you going to provide valid identification, or do we need to escalate this further?" James remained calm, though his jaw tightened. Ever so slightly, he handed over his driver's license. "Here's my valid ID. You'll find that everything checks out." Miller took the license, but his expression didn't change. He handed it to Bradley, who appeared uncomfortable but nonetheless began radioing the information back to dispatch. Mia crossed her arms, her voice gaining a sharper edge. "What exactly do you think we're doing here? Swimming while black? My husband has done nothing wrong. We've complied with your questions, provided identification, and yet here you are, treating us like criminals." Miller turned to her, his voice condescending. "Ma'am, if there's no issue, we'll confirm and be on our way. But until then, I'd appreciate it if you stayed calm." "Stayed calm?" Mia's voice rose slightly, her frustration spilling over. "You've humiliated my family in front of everyone here. You've scared my children. And for what? Because we don't fit the image of who you think should be at a place like this?" Caleb, who had been standing near his father, shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, what's happening?" he asked, his voice small and unsure. James knelt beside him, keeping his voice steady. "It's okay, Caleb. It's just a misunderstanding." But Caleb wasn't convinced. He looked up at Miller and Bradley, his young face filled with confusion and unease. Lily, still clinging to Mia's hand, began to cry softly. Are they taking Daddy away?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mia knelt down, wrapping her arms around Lily. "No, baby," she said firmly. "Daddy's not going anywhere." Bradley, who had been silent up to this point, stepped forward slightly. "Miller, maybe we should—" But Miller cut him off. "We'll handle this by the book," he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. By now a small crowd had gathered, guests standing at a distance with their phones out, recording the interaction. Some murmured to one another, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. "Well, don't you check the guest registry again," Mia said, her tone biting. "Maybe it'll help you realize just how unnecessary all of this is." Before Miller could respond, a voice from the crowd called out, "Leave them alone. They're obviously not doing anything wrong." Miller's eyes darted toward the voice, his expression darkening. But he quickly refocused on James. "Sir, until we verify everything, I'm going to ask you to leave the pool area." James stood, his tall frame towering over the officer. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable steeliness in his tone. "I've already told you who I am, and I've given you my identification. I'm not going anywhere unless you have a valid reason to detain me." Miller stepped closer, his hand resting on the handcuffs at his belt. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Don't," Mia said, stepping between them. Her voice was low and dangerous, filled with a quiet fury. "You have no grounds to arrest him. My husband has complied with every one of your unreasonable demands. If you touch him, you'll be violating his rights, and I promise you, you will regret it." Miller's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. Instead, he nodded to Bradley. "We're detaining him until we can confirm everything." Bradley hesitated, glancing at James and then at the crowd. "Miller, maybe we should wait." "Miller, you don't want to do this," James said evenly, his eyes locked on the officer. "You're making a mistake." But Miller ignored him. He reached for the handcuffs, and before anyone could stop him, he snapped them onto James's wrists. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut echoed across the pool area. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Caleb took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad!" he shouted. Lily began to cry harder, burying her face in Mia's dress. Mia's voice rose, sharp and commanding. "You just put handcuffs on a federal agent in front of his children. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Miller ignored her, but Bradley looked visibly uneasy. "Miller, I think we need to step back." "It's under control," Miller snapped. James stood still, his calm demeanor unshaken, despite the humiliation. He looked at Caleb, his voice steady. "It's okay, son. Everything's going to be okay." But Caleb wasn't convinced. He looked at his father, his young face filled with confusion and fear. The crowd was no longer silent. Guests began speaking up, their voices filled with outrage. "This is ridiculous," one woman shouted. "He didn't do anything wrong." Another guest added, "Why are they arresting him? He's clearly not a threat." Mia turned to the crowd, her voice loud and firm. "You're all watching this. You're recording it. Good, because this is what happens when people like us are seen as threats for simply existing." Her words hung heavy in the air, silencing the murmurs for a moment. Miller, however, seemed unfazed. He began leading James toward the exit, but before they could get far, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to see a senior officer, Captain Davis, approaching. His posture was authoritative, his face unreadable. Bradley stepped forward quickly. "Captain, we were just—" But Davis raised a hand, cutting him off. His sharp eyes landed on James and then on Miller. "Remove the cuffs. Now." Miller hesitated, but under Davis's glare, he reluctantly obeyed. As the cuffs fell away, James rubbed his wrists, his expression calm but his eyes burning with quiet anger. Davis turned to James. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, sir. I'll make sure this is addressed immediately." Mia stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "Sorry isn't enough. My husband was humiliated in front of his children, in front of everyone here, for no reason other than your officer's prejudice." Davis's expression hardened, but he nodded. "You're right. This will be handled, I assure you." But as James looked around, at his shaken children, at his furious wife, and at the silent crowd, he knew that this moment would stay with him far longer than any apology could fix. The sun continued to shine, indifferent to the escalating tension by the poolside. What had started as a peaceful family getaway had turned into a humiliating spectacle for the walkers. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as more guests paused their activities to watch the scene unfold. Phones were raised. their lenses capturing the moment as James Walker, a federal agent, stood calmly in the face of blatant injustice. Officer Miller tightened his grip on the handcuffs, his expression a mask of authority and misplaced righteousness. "Put your hands behind your back," he barked at James. James didn't flinch. His eyes locked on Miller's, calm but piercing. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice steady. "This is unnecessary." Mia stepped forward, her voice cutting through the growing noise. "What's unnecessary is this blatant harassment," she snapped. "You've confirmed his identity, you've verified our room number, and yet you're still treating him like a criminal. What exactly is it that you think he's done?" Miller ignored her, his focus solely on James. "Hands behind your back, now," he repeated, his tone cold and unyielding. "Daddy?" Lily's small, trembling voice broke through the tension. She stood clutching Mia's dress, her wide, tear-filled eyes fixed on her father. James turned slightly, his calm demeanor softening for a moment. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'll be fine." But the sight of his daughter's fear only fueled Mia's fury. She stepped in front of James, her body shielding him from the officers. "You are not putting handcuffs on him in front of our children," she said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. Miller's patience snapped. He reached past Mia, grabbing James's wrist. The movement was quick and deliberate, and the sound of the cuffs clicking shut was like a gunshot in the silent crowd. "Stop it!" Caleb shouted, his young voice breaking. He stepped forward instinctively, but Mia pulled him back. "No, Caleb," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. Her arms wrapped protectively around both children, her body shaking with anger and helplessness. The crowd gasped as the scene unfolded. More phones were raised, their cameras zooming in on James, whose tall frame remained steady despite the humiliation of being restrained in public. "Is this what you do to an innocent man?" Mia shouted, her voice raw. "In front of his children? This isn't just racist, it's disgusting." Miller tightened his hold on James's arm. "Ma'am, step back. We're doing our job." "Your job?" Mia's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass and humiliate a family for daring to exist in a space you think we don't belong in." James glanced back at Mia, his calm expression masking the storm raging inside him. "Mia, it's okay," he said quietly. No. It's not okay," she shot back, her eyes blazing. "You've done nothing wrong, and they know it. They're just too blind with prejudice to admit it." Caleb, his young face tight with fear and confusion, clung to Mia's arm. "Mom, why are they doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mia knelt down, pulling both children into her arms. "Because some people can't see past the color of our skin," she said softly, her voice breaking. "But we're not going to let them make us feel small. You hear me? We're going to stand tall." Lily sobbed into her mother's shoulder, her small body trembling. "I don't want them to take Daddy," she whimpered. "They're not taking Daddy," Mia said fiercely, her voice steadying as she stroked Lily's hair. "We won't let them." Meanwhile, James stood still, his hands cuffed behind his back, his calm exterior betraying none of the humiliation he felt. His years in law enforcement had prepared him for many things, but nothing could have prepared him for this, for being reduced to a stereotype in front of his wife and children, for having his authority and dignity stripped away so casually. The crowd began to murmur louder, their disapproval growing. "This is wrong," someone said. "He's not even resisting." Another voice added, "Why are they arresting him? He's with his family." Miller's face tightened as he glanced around, his authority being chipped away by the growing dissent. "Everyone step back," he barked. "This is a police matter." But the crowd didn't move. If anything, they edged closer, their cameras recording every second. "Let him go," a woman shouted. "You're just making it worse," another added. Miller turned back to James, his grip tightening. "Let's move," he said. James met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. But before Miller could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "What the hell is going on here?" The crowd parted as Captain Davis strode forward, his authoritative presence commanding immediate attention. His sharp eyes took in the scene, the handcuffs on James, the crying children, the furious wife, and the restless crowd. "Captain," Bradley began, but Davis raised a hand to silence him. He turned to Miller, his voice cold. "Why is this man in handcuffs?" Miller straightened, his confidence faltering. "We had a report of unauthorized individuals?" "And did you verify that report?" Davis asked sharply, his tone brooking no argument. Well, yes, but..." "Then remove the cuffs. Now." Miller hesitated, but under Davis's glare he had no choice. With a reluctant sigh, he unlocked the handcuffs, the loud click signaling James's release. As the cuffs fell away, James rubbed his wrists, his calm demeanor intact, though his eyes burned with quiet anger. Davis turned to James, his expression unreadable. "I apologize for this, sir. It shouldn't have happened." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at his wife and children, their tear-streaked faces breaking his heart. He stepped forward, wrapping his arms around them. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice steady. "I'm here." But Mia wasn't done. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on Davis. "An apology isn't enough," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "My husband is a federal agent. He showed his credentials. He followed every order. And yet you still allowed your officers to treat him like a criminal. Do you have any idea what you've done to my children, to my family?" Davis met her gaze, his expression hardening. "This will be addressed, ma'am, I assure you." "Addressed?" Mia shot back. "You think that fixes this? You think that erases what just happened? My children just watched their father be humiliated for no reason, other than the color of his skin?" The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement, their voices rising in support of the walkers. "You'll be hearing from a lawyer," Mia said firmly, her voice carrying across the pool area. "This isn't over." Davis nodded, his jaw tight. "Understood." As the officers retreated, the crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, their eyes following the walkers as they gathered their belongings. James placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, his touch gentle. "Let's go," he said softly. Mia looked up at him, her eyes still blazing. "They're not getting away with this," she said. "I know," James replied, "and we'll fight. Together." With that, the walkers left the pool area, their heads held high, despite the weight of what had just happened. But the sting of humiliation lingered, a painful reminder of the battles they would continue to face. As Captain Davis stood before the scene, the energy shifted palpably. His sharp, commanding presence silenced the escalating commotion, but the tension in the air remained thick. James, now uncuffed, stood tall, his composed demeanor masking the humiliation that simmered beneath the surface. Mia, however, was far from calm. Her protective instincts as a mother and her unyielding resolve as a lawyer collided in a fury she could no longer suppress. Davis turned toward Officer Miller, his gaze cold and piercing. "Explain yourself," he demanded, his voice low but powerful. Miller hesitated, the usual confidence in his stance now faltering. "Captain, we were responding to a report." Davis cut him off sharply. "A report that you clearly failed to handle with any measure of professionalism. You handcuffed a man, an FBI agent no less, in front of his family without cause." Miller stiffened but said nothing, his jaw tightening as he shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his superior's reprimand. Davis turned to James, his tone shifting slightly, now carrying a forced politeness. "Sir, I deeply regret what's happened here. On behalf of the department, I apologize." James studied the man carefully, his gaze unflinching. An apology doesn't erase what just happened," he said quietly, his voice firm but steady. Davis nodded as though he expected the response. "You're right, it doesn't. But I'll make sure this is addressed properly. I'll personally oversee an investigation into the conduct of my officers." Mia stepped forward before James could respond, her eyes blazing with indignation. "That's not enough," she snapped. "You think an investigation is going to undo the trauma my children just experienced? You think it'll erase the fact that my husband, a man who served his country with honor, was treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin?" Lily, still clutching Mia's hand, buried her face in her mother's side. Caleb stood close to his father, his young face taut with confusion and anger. Davis opened his mouth to respond, but Mia didn't give him the chance. "This is systemic," she continued, her voice rising. "This isn't about one report or one officer's mistake. This is about a culture that sees black families as threats instead of people. And I promise you, we are not letting this go." Her words rang out across the pool area, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Guests who had been silently watching began to speak up. "She's right," one woman said loudly. "This was completely unnecessary." Another guest chimed in. "They didn't do anything wrong. This is racism, plain and simple." A man stepped forward, his phone still raised. "I got it all on video," he said. "This is going online. People need to see what happened here." The crowd, once passive and hesitant, was now visibly agitated, their murmurs growing louder. Davis glanced around, his jaw tightening, as the realization of the situation's gravity sunk in. This wasn't just an incident to be smoothed over. It was a public reckoning. James took a step forward, placing a calming hand on Mia's shoulder. "Mia," he said softly. She turned to him, her eyes filled with unshed tears of frustration. "James, they need to hear this," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied gently, "and they are. But let's focus on the kids." Mia looked down at Lily and Caleb, her anger momentarily softening as she pulled them closer. "We're okay," she murmured to them. "We're okay." James turned back to Davis. "Captain, I'll accept your apology when it's backed by action. Your officers crossed a line today, and this won't be swept under the rug." Davis nodded solemnly. "I understand, Mr. Walker. I give you my word, this will be handled appropriately." Mia's laugh was cold and bitter. "Your word?" she said. "Forgive me if I don't find that reassuring." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their discontent palpable. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her voice loud and clear. "We've all been watching this. It's disgusting, and it's unacceptable. You should be ashamed." Several others voiced their agreement, their words blending into a chorus of support for the Walkers. James turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of strangers who had watched his family's humiliation. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet strength. Mia, still holding Lily close, looked out at the crowd, her resolve hardening. "We can't let this keep happening," she said, her voice firm but weary. "Not to us, not to anyone." The man with the phone nodded. "Don't worry," he said. "People are going to hear about this." Davis, visibly uncomfortable now, turned to his officers. "Miller, Bradley, I'll be expecting a full report on my desk by the end of the day," he said curtly. Miller nodded stiffly, his face a mix of anger and embarrassment. Bradley, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, glanced at the Walkers with what almost looked like regret before following Miller. As the officers left, Davis turned back to James and Mia. "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to contact me directly." He handed James a business card, the gesture feeling hollow. James took the card but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Mia, however, wasn't done. "What we need," she said, her voice icy, "is for you and your officers to take a hard look at the biases that led to this. Because until you do, this will keep happening. To us, to others. And next time, it might not end so peacefully." Davis met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I hear you, ma'am," he said, "and I'll make sure your concerns are addressed." The Walkers said nothing as Davis walked away, leaving them standing by the pool with the eyes of the crowd still on them. Caleb broke the silence, his voice small but steady. "Dad, why did they do that to you?" James knelt down, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Because some people make bad assumptions," he said softly. "But it's not about what they think. It's about how we stand up to them." Caleb nodded slowly, his young mind processing his father's words. Mia knelt beside Lily, wiping away her tears. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked gently. Lily nodded hesitantly, but her small hands still clung tightly to her mother. James stood, his gaze meeting Mia's. "Let's go," he said quietly. She nodded, her expression still fierce but tinged with exhaustion. Together, They gathered their belongings, their heads held high despite the weight of what had just happened. As they walked away, the crowd parted for them, their murmurs following the family. The support was evident, but so was the lingering discomfort. The walkers had won the moment, but the battle was far from over. Mia looked at James as they walked. "This isn't the end," she said firmly. James nodded. "No," he replied. "It's just the beginning." And with that, they left the pool area, their family united in purpose, ready to take the next step in their fight for justice. The walkers returned to their suite, the door closing behind them with a weight that felt heavier than the world outside. The luxurious room, with its ocean views and serene decor, now felt hollow. The laughter and joy from earlier that day seemed like a distant memory. James set his bag down on the counter and turned to see his wife, Mia, kneeling by the couch, pulling their tearful daughter, Lily, into her arms. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly together, his face etched with confusion and anger. Mia's voice was soft, soothing as she rocked Lily gently. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, stroking her daughter's curly hair. "Daddy's here. We're all here." James knelt down beside them, his broad shoulders seeming to carry more than just the weight of the day. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with regret. Caleb looked up, his young face tight with frustration. "But why, Dad? Why did they do that to you? You didn't do anything wrong." James sighed, sitting on the floor to be at eye level with his son. "Sometimes people see someone who looks like us, and they make unfair judgments," he said carefully. "They think we don't belong, no matter how wrong they are." "But you're an FBI agent," Caleb protested, his voice rising. "You protect people. How could they treat you like that?" Mia glanced at James, her eyes filled with both pride and pain. James took a deep breath. "Caleb," he said gently, "even with everything I've done, even with my badge, there are still people who see me and us as a threat. Just because of the color of our skin. It's not right and it's not fair, but it's something we have to face." "That's not fair," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "No, it's not," Mia interjected firmly, her voice strong again. "And that's why we fight. That's why your dad and I work so hard, not just for us, but for everyone who faces this kind of injustice. We won't let them define us by their prejudice." Lily lifted her head from Mia's shoulder, her tear-streaked face breaking James's heart. Why were they so mean to you, Daddy?" she asked softly. James leaned forward, his large hands gently taking Lily's tiny ones. "Because they didn't understand," he said, his voice tender. "But you know what? It doesn't matter what they think. What matters is that we stand together as a family and show them they can't break us." Mia nodded, her arms still wrapped protectively around Lily. "We are strong," she said firmly, "and we're going to make sure people know what happened today." James stood, his jaw tightening as he looked out the window at the ocean. "It's not just about us," he said quietly. "This happens to so many people, people who don't have the platform or the resources to fight back. We have to do something." Mia stood as well, her resolve hardening. "We will," she said, moving to her bag and pulling out her phone. "I'm calling Ella. She needs to get started on this right away." Ella was Mia's colleague at the law firm, a sharp and relentless attorney who had worked on multiple civil rights cases. If anyone could turn this incident into a catalyst for change, it was her. James watched as Mia began typing furiously on her phone, her fingers moving with precision and purpose. "What's the plan?" he asked. And Mia didn't look up. First, we document everything. We get the videos from the guests at the pool, the incident reports, anything and everything that shows what happened today. Then we file complaints against the officers, the resort, anyone who contributed to this." James nodded, his admiration for his wife growing with every word. "And then?" Mia looked up, her eyes blazing. "And then we make sure this story is heard. This isn't just about us, James. This is about every family that's ever been treated like this. We're going to hold them accountable." Caleb, still sitting on the bed, looked at his parents with wide eyes. "Are they going to get in trouble?" he asked. "They will," Mia said firmly, meeting her son's gaze. "Because we're not going to let this go." James sat down beside Caleb, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "And we're going to teach you and Lily how to stand up for yourselves, how to fight for what's right, no matter what. This world can be unfair, but we don't give up." Caleb nodded slowly, his young face filled with determination. "I want to help," he said quietly. "You already are," James said with a small smile. The room grew quiet for a moment, the weight of the day settling over them. Outside, the ocean waves crashed against the shore, a steady reminder of the calm they had hoped for but didn't find. Mia broke the silence. "James," she said, her voice softer now. "This isn't just about today. It's about everything we've faced. The stares, the whispers, the assumptions. It's time we do more." James turned to her, his brow furrowed. "We've been doing more," he said. "Not like this," Mia replied. "This isn't just about us anymore. This is about showing Caleb and Lily and everyone else that we won't stand for this." James nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "It's time." As Mia continued her calls and messages, James turned back to the children. Caleb was now lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, while Lily had curled up beside Mia, her tiny hand gripping her mother's arm. James sat down beside them, his heart heavy but his resolve stronger than ever. "We're going to be okay," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Mia glanced over, her expression softening as she saw the man she loved carrying so much weight on his shoulders. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice steady. "Together." James nodded, his gaze distant but focused. This wasn't just about clearing his name or fighting for justice for his family. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what they had endured. The walkers might have been shaken, but they were far from broken, and as the night fell over the resort, the family sat together, their unity unshaken, ready to face whatever came next. The morning sun bathed the resort in golden light as the walkers packed their belongings in silence. The laughter and joy that had filled their first day had been replaced by a quiet resolve. Though the memories of the humiliation they had endured still stung, they were determined not to let it define their story. James zipped up the last suitcase and turned to Caleb and Lily, who sat on the edge of the bed. "You two ready?" he asked gently. Caleb nodded, his expression more mature than it had been just a day ago. Lily clung to her stuffed animal, her wide eyes still carrying a hint of unease, but she nodded as well. Mia, standing by the balcony, took one last look at the ocean. "We came here for peace," she said softly, "and instead we were reminded of how much work still needs to be done." James joined her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But we're leaving stronger," he said. "They didn't break us." Mia turned to him, her gaze filled with both love and determination. "They didn't," she agreed. "But this isn't the end. This is just the beginning." The family made their way to the lobby, passing by the pool where it had all begun. The once buzzy area was quieter now, but the memory of the confrontation lingered like a shadow. A few guests noticed them as they walked by, nodding subtly in acknowledgement. At the front desk, the manager stood nervously, his hands clasped tightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker," he began, his voice hesitant, "I can't express how sorry we are for everything that happened. Your stay has been fully refunded, and we've taken steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." Pia's eyes narrowed slightly. "Refunding our stay doesn't erase what happened," she said firmly. "And words alone won't change a system that allows people like us to be treated like second-class citizens. We'll be following up." The manager nodded quickly, his discomfort evident. "Of course, ma'am. If there's anything else we can do." "There is," James interrupted, his voice calm but authoritative. "Listen, learn, make sure no one else has to go through this." The manager nodded again, his gaze lowering as the walkers turned and walked out of the resort. As they loaded their bags into the car, Caleb spoke up. "Mom, Dad, are we really going to make them pay for what they did?" Mia knelt down to face him, her expression softening. "It's not about making them pay, Caleb," she said. "It's about making sure people know what happened, so that they think twice before doing it to someone else." James placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "We're standing up, son. Not just for us, but for everyone who's been through something like this. That's how change happens." Caleb nodded slowly, his young face filled with determination. "I get it," he said. Lily, still holding her stuffed animal, looked up at her father. "Will they stop being mean to us now?" she asked softly. Lily, still holding her stuffed animal in her hand, beaming, the diminutive agent closed her eyes and glanced at the news report. She began preparing to turn the page. James crouched down to her level, his voice gentle. "Maybe not right away, sweetie," he said. "But if enough people stand up, things can get better. That's why we have to be strong." As they pulled out of the resort, the ocean shimmering in the distance, Mia looked back at the building one last time. "They'll remember us," she said quietly. "Not for what they thought we were, but for what we stood for." James nodded, his hand steady on the wheel. "And so will everyone else who sees this story," he said. The The Walker's story is not unique. For too many Black families, moments of joy and peace are interrupted by the weight of prejudice and systemic injustice. The humiliation James endured, the fear Caleb and Lily felt, and the rage Mia expressed are experiences shared by countless others who are judged not for their actions, but for their appearance. But the Walker story is also one of resilience and resolve. They faced injustice head on and refused to be silenced. Their pain became their strength, their humiliation a call to action. This story is a reminder to all of us. Racism is not just a personal issue. It's a systemic problem that requires collective action. It's a call to recognize our own biases, to stand up when we see injustice, and to create a world where no family has to endure what the Walkers did. As the Walkers drove away, their heads held high, they carried with them not just the pain of their experience, but the hope for a better future. They weren't just victims of racism, they were fighters against it. Their journey is far from over, but they've taken the first step. And through their story, they remind us all of the power of unity, love, and courage in the face of injustice. Let us all take their story as a lesson. Change begins with awareness, grows through action, and thrives on collective resolve. Together, we can build a world where no one is judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The fight against racism isn't theirs alone. It's ours. Let's stand together.